In episode 14, Integrate Risk Management Methods into Daily Decisions, we shift risk from being a periodic paperwork exercise into something that shapes everyday engineering and product choices. Instead of seeing risk registers as static artifacts that live in shared drives, you will start to view them as living tools that guide design, prioritization, and trade-offs. The intent is not to turn every conversation into a formal assessment, but to give you a mental model that quietly informs how you judge options and allocate effort. When risk concepts are familiar and lightweight, teams stop treating them as external demands and begin using them as a natural language for uncertainty. That mindset is exactly what complex application environments and modern exams both expect. A practical risk discipline begins with identifying assets, threats, vulnerabilities, and exposures in living registers that reflect the real environment. Assets are not just applications and databases. They include datasets, critical processes, interfaces, identities, and third-party services that matter to the mission. Threats describe actors and events that could cause harm, from external attackers to internal mistakes and environmental disruptions. Vulnerabilities capture weaknesses in design, implementation, configuration, or process that those threats could exploit. Exposures describe where assets and vulnerabilities intersect with threat paths, such as internet-facing endpoints, poorly segmented networks, or unmanaged integrations. When these elements are captured and updated in simple, accessible registers, risk stops being a guessed feeling and becomes a concrete picture people can examine together. Estimating likelihood and impact then turns that picture into a prioritization tool rather than a list of worries. Likelihood should use calibrated scales that mean the same thing across teams, such as frequencies over a defined time window or categories tied to shared reference scenarios. Impact also needs shared anchors, describing what minor, significant, and severe consequences look like in terms of data loss, service disruption, legal exposure, and reputational harm. These scales allow people to disagree constructively because they can point to examples instead of arguing in vague terms. Over time, repeated use of common scales makes judgments more stable and less dependent on who happens to be in the room. Qualitative heat maps are often the first place organizations land, and they remain useful when combined with lightweight quantitative approximations. A heat map paints likelihood and impact on colored grids, making patterns visible quickly, but it can become subjective if the underlying reasoning is not explicit. Simple quantitative approximations, such as estimated incident frequencies, affected user counts, or approximate cost ranges, add a layer of discipline without demanding complex modeling. The goal is not to calculate perfect numbers, but to ensure that high, medium, and low labels mean something grounded in reality. When qualitative and approximate quantitative views align, you have a more trustworthy basis for prioritizing action. Once risks are characterized, the focus turns to treatment options: avoid, reduce, transfer, or accept, each with a documented rationale. Avoidance might mean deciding not to pursue a feature or integration that introduces disproportionate exposure. Reduction covers changes to design, controls, or processes that lower likelihood or impact to an acceptable level. Transfer includes mechanisms such as insurance or contractual arrangements that shift portions of financial or operational burden without pretending the underlying exposure disappears. Acceptance becomes a deliberate choice, not a default outcome, when you record why residual risk is tolerable in the current context. Writing down these rationales helps future reviewers understand decisions and prevents quiet drift into unmanaged exposure. Treatments only become real when mitigations are tied to specific controls, owners, budgets, and measurable target states. A mitigation plan that says improve authentication is too vague. One that names a control framework, lists systems in scope, assigns accountable teams, and defines what success looks like is actionable. Budgets ensure that people and technology resources are available to implement the changes. Without them, risk reduction remains hypothetical. Target states describe conditions such as coverage percentages, response times, or architecture patterns that indicate when a risk has been reduced to the intended level. This structure bridges the gap between risk analysis and the day-to-day work of engineering and operations. Because conditions are never static, systematic reassessment becomes as important as initial analysis. Significant changes in architecture, technology platforms, business models, or regulatory environments can invalidate assumptions about likelihood and impact. Incidents provide hard evidence that some risks were underestimated, misunderstood, or missed entirely, while new intelligence about threats or vulnerabilities can reveal emerging dangers. Reassessment does not require starting from zero. It often means revisiting key entries in the register, updating estimates, and adjusting treatment plans. When reassessment is tied to real triggers, rather than occasional calendar reminders, risk information stays closer to the truth of the environment. Accepted risks deserve special attention because they can linger quietly unless captured with review dates and explicit triggers to revisit. An entry that documents acceptance should specify who agreed, under what assumptions, and until when that decision stands before it must be reconsidered. Triggers might include user growth beyond a threshold, adoption in new regions, introduction of sensitive data types, or repeated near misses. These conditions give you a reason to reopen the discussion instead of letting acceptance harden into permanent neglect. Treating accepted risk as a time-bound, revisitable decision keeps the register honest and aligned with evolving reality. Integrating risk checkpoints into planning, design reviews, and release gates is how you ensure methods influence real work. During planning, risk checkpoints help teams verify that new initiatives have considered high-level threats and obligations, not just feature lists and deadlines. Design reviews can include brief segments where key risks are restated and mapped to proposed controls, preventing security considerations from being bolted on at the end. Release gates can require confirmation that agreed treatments are in place or that deviations have been documented and approved as temporary exceptions. These checkpoints do not need to be long. Their power comes from being routine, predictable, and tied to visible decisions. Telemetry and incidents then connect the register's hypotheses to observed reality, closing an important loop. Every risk entry is, at its core, a hypothesis about how the environment might fail and what that would mean. Telemetry from logs, monitoring systems, user reports, and operational metrics shows whether those hypotheses were accurate, optimistic, or pessimistic. Incidents and near misses offer especially rich data, revealing patterns of failure, detection times, and recovery behaviors that can be compared with prior estimates. When you connect these signals back to the register, you turn risk management into a learning system rather than a static catalog. Communicating trade-offs plainly is essential because risk discussions must often span technical and non-technical audiences. Descriptions that focus only on vulnerabilities or threat actors can leave product and business leaders without a clear sense of what is at stake. Framing options in terms of user impact, operational constraints, and opportunity costs invites more meaningful participation. It becomes easier to say, for example, that a certain mitigation will slightly slow the release schedule but significantly reduce the chance of large-scale data exposure. Simple, honest language about trade-offs helps teams and leaders make decisions they can stand behind later. Finally, Feedback loops ensure that retired risks stay retired, and controls remain effective over time. When a risk is marked as treated, there should be some form of verification that controls are not only deployed but operating as intended. Periodic tests, targeted exercises, or small internal audits can reveal whether the environment has drifted away from the designed state. If new risks emerge or old ones reappear, that information feeds back into the identification and estimation steps, refining future judgments. This cycle of identification, treatment, verification, and learning is what turns risk management from a static framework into a living practice. A brief mini-review helps lock these ideas together. You identify assets, threats, vulnerabilities, and exposures, estimate likelihood and impact using shared scales, and blend qualitative visuals with simple quantitative approximations. You choose treatments with clear rationales, tie mitigations to controls and owners, and reassess after meaningful changes or incidents. You record accepted risks with review dates, integrate checkpoints into daily workflows, connect telemetry to risk hypotheses, and communicate trade-offs in straightforward terms. Feedback loops then keep the register and controls aligned with reality, so governance and learning remain tightly connected. Seen as a whole, this approach aligns both with exam expectations and with the demands of complex, evolving systems. The conclusion for episode 14 is to bring the concept down to a single, concrete step. Update one risk record today with clearer descriptions, fresher estimates, or improved treatment details. That small act turns theory into action and gives you a template for improving other entries over time. The next action is to schedule a quarterly review where key risks, treatments, and accepted decisions are revisited in light of recent changes and events. As you repeat that cycle, risk management methods will feel less like a separate discipline and more like the underlying logic of everyday engineering and product decisions. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.